Welcome to the deep dive. We take complex topics, dive into the sources, and pull out the key insights so you get informed fast.
And today, we're tackling someone really monumental, a figure whose own father thought he was just an ordinary boy, maybe even below the common standard.
Hard to believe, right? Because this is the person who completely reshaped how we understand life itself. Charles Darwin.
Exactly. And that quote about his father, it just hooks you, doesn't it? Because his early life, well, wasn't exactly pointing towards scientific geniuses.
Not at all. I mean, you mentioned that anecdote about the beetles.
Oh yeah, classic Darwin. So keen on collecting at Cambridge, he finds two rare beetles, already has one in each hand.
So what did he do?
Pops one in his mouth to grab the other one, only for it to squirt this awful burning fluid. It just shows this almost obsessive curiosity he had from early on.
It really does, and that's what we want to explore today. The man, his incredible discoveries, and the really complex legacy he left behind. How did he revolutionize, well, everything?
We've got a stack of sources, Wikipedia articles on him, and on the origin of species, stuff on his emotion research, historical accounts of the whole creation-evolution debate, even bits from a documentary on the Beagle voyage.
Our mission is to pull out the key stuff, the surprising details, without getting totally lost in the weeds. And just think about his impact. His Wikipedia page exists in, what, over 200 languages?
It's staggering. Shows his global relevance, even now.
So let's start at the beginning. Charles Robert Darwin, born February 12, 1809, fifth of six kids. His father, Robert, was a wealthy doctor. His mother, Susanna, was a Wedgwood.
And those family roots are interesting, aren't they? His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had actually written about evolutionary ideas, sort of proto-evolution, in his book Zoonomia.
And his other grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, the famous potter, was a major abolitionist. So there's this background of intellectual ferment and social conscience.
Definitely. Though maybe not enough to push him in the right direction initially. His dad wanted him to be a doctor, sent him off to Edinburgh.
Yeah, but that didn't really take, did it? The sources mention how he found surgery. This was long before the blessed days of chloroform, just horrific.
Absolutely stomach-churning for him. It apparently haunted him for years. So, medicine was out.
Quite a conversation that must have been with his father. Dad, I can't handle the blood.
Right. So plan B, become a clergyman, off to Cambridge. Darwin himself said it seemed agreeable enough.
But his heart wasn't really in it.
He admitted he didn't have, a deep conviction in all the required 39 articles of the Anglican faith. It wasn't a true calling.
So doctor, no. Clergyman, But these failures, they sort of accidentally steered him towards his real passion, didn't they? That beetle collecting intensity.
Exactly. It pushed him towards direct observation, towards nature, which led to the big opportunity.
HMS Beagle, how did that even happen for someone who wasn't yet a finished naturalist, as they put it?
His mentor at Cambridge, Professor Henslow, recommended him, believed in him, said he was the very man they are in search of, which is quite something.
And the captain, Fitzroy. He sounds like quite a character. Unusual, the sources say.
Yeah, and there was some initial friction. Fitzroy was a staunch conservative, a high Tory, while Darwin leaned more liberal, a low Whig. Different worlds.
But Fitzroy gave him a gift that turned out to be incredibly important, right?
Yes. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. That book was revolutionary, arguing the Earth was shaped by slow, gradual processes over immense time. It completely shaped Darwin's thinking.
And the voyage itself wasn't some gentle scientific cruise. There's that mention of a punishment parade.
Right, early on, a sailor named Davies got 24 lashes. Brutal. It really drives home the harsh realities of naval life.
And Darwin wasn't exactly cool as a cucumber heading out. He had palpitations and pain about the heart, thought he had heart disease.
Yeah, quite anxious. But he was determined to go at all hazards. That tells you something about his drive even then. It also, perhaps subtly, reinforced ideas about struggle and survival.
Once they were sailing, though, and he got ashore, he really got into his element. The shore-going fellow, they called him.
Constantly exploring. And you see him immediately diving into the local details in South America. The gauchos, for instance.
Yes, the lasso or lazo and the bolas, those weighted cords.
Exactly. He was fascinated by how they used them to catch animals. He even tried the bolas himself.
And
promptly tangled up his own horse's legs. Apparently, the gauchos found it hilarious, saying they'd never before seen a man caught by himself. A bit embarrassing, maybe, but shows his hands-on approach.
He was also noting down everything about the local animals, wasn't he? The tucutuco.
Yeah, that mole-like rodent with its weird nasal grunt. And the silly partridges you could apparently catch just by riding around them in circles. These little specific details, these adaptations, they were all starting to pile up.
And the landscapes themselves amazed him, those huge salt lakes in Patagonia.
Teeming with life. Flamingos, even worms living in concentrated brine. It led him to write, "Every part of the world is habitable." You can feel his sense of wonder.
His geological observations were also key, especially after witnessing that massive earthquake in Chile in 1835.
A huge moment. He felt the ship shuddering, saw the land itself physically lifted by 2 or 3 feet. Permanently?
Which directly contradicted the idea that Earth's features were all formed by sudden catastrophes.
Precisely. It was powerful evidence for Lyell's uniformitarianism, the idea of slow, continuous change over vast timescales. Finding fossil seashells high up in the Andes, despite his altitude sickness, or puna, was another piece of that puzzle. He was ecstatic. Fossil trees and rock layers, too. It all pointed to a very old, very dynamic Earth.
He wasn't just looking at rocks and animals, though. His observations of people are, well, they're very revealing of his time, the Fuegians, for instance.
Yes, near Cape Horn. His descriptions are quite stark, calling them the most abject and miserable creatures. He noted their appearance, their language sounding like clearing a throat, their mimicry skills, their fear of guns.
There's that strange detail about them sweating profusely near the fire, even more than the clothed crew members.
Right, and finding it ludicrous that they couldn't keep time when singing. These observations, however uncomfortable they might read now, were pushing him to think about human variation and humanity's place in nature, not separate from it. It planted seeds for his later work on human descent.
And then there is that whole experiment with trying to civilize some Fuegians in England, York, Fuegia, and Jemmy Button, and return them.
A melancholy experience, as Darwin called it. Leaving them was hard, and finding out later they'd largely reverted to their old ways, with Jemmy even complaining his own brother stole from him. It was a complex lesson in culture and environment.
He also commented on gender roles among the groups he encountered, seeing women as useful slaves and men focused on fighting. Again, very much a perspective of his era.
All these encounters, all these observations, they were pieces he was collecting. And then came the Galapagos.
The famous finches. But it wasn't just the finches, was it?
No, though they became iconic later. At the time, he also noted the giant tortoises. The vice governor there could apparently tell which island a tortoise came from just by looking at its shell shape, or even by its taste.
That level of specific island-by-island variation must have been striking.
Hugely. And the mockingbirds, or mocking thrushes, also varied distinctly from island to island. This really aroused his attention, as he put it. Why these clear differences in such similar nearby places?
And the marine iguanas.
Totally unique, the only lizards that eat seaweed. Another specific adaptation. The big question forming in his mind was, why were the creatures on these relatively new volcanic islands so clearly related to South American types, even though the physical environments were different? Why weren't they, say, African types or unique creations? It didn't fit the standard view of fixed species.
So the Galapagos provided crucial clues, but the full theory didn't just snap into place there.
No, it needed time to percolate. Back in England, a few years later in 1838, he read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population.
About human populations growing faster than their food supply.
Exactly. Malthus was talking about humans, but Darwin had this flash of insight. This applies everywhere in nature. There's a constant struggle for existence, as he later called it, echoing others like de Candolle, who talked about a warring of the species.
Because more offspring are produced than can possibly survive?
Precisely. And that was the key. In that struggle, any tiny variation that gave an organism even a slight edge, better camouflage, a beak slightly better suited for cracking seeds, whatever would make it more likely to survive and reproduce.
And pass that advantageous trait on.
Yes. While unfavorable variations would tend to be weeded out. Over generations and generations, these tiny advantages accumulate. He pictured it like 100,000 wedges, constantly forcing their way into the economy of nature, driving adaptation.
Which led him to the tree of life idea.
A powerful metaphor. All life branching out from common ancestors, like a tree. New branches sprout, new species evolve, older branches die off extinction. It explains shared characteristics, diversity, everything, as a result of continuous change, not separate creations.
Though apparently explaining it even to his wife Emma was tough, he felt hopelessly wrong.
It was such a radical idea, and maybe that's partly why he waited so long to publish. Over 20 years.
20 years. Why the delay? Fear of the reaction.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. He knew it would be controversial, didn't want to add to prejudices. Plus, he suffered from terrible health problems, constant stomach issues, vomiting, shivering. It must have been incredibly draining.
So what finally pushed him to publish?
Alfred Russel Wallace, another naturalist working independently in Southeast Asia, came up with essentially the same theory of natural selection.
Wow, really?
Yeah, Wallace sent Darwin his manuscript in 1858. Darwin was stunned, but it spurred him into action. They ended up presenting joint papers first.
A sort of scientific race to the finish, almost. He also had allies, right? Hooker, Huxley.
Crucial support. Botanist Joseph Hooker, biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog for his fierce defense, and American botanist Asa Gray. They helped champion his ideas.
And then 1859, On the Origin of Species, finally comes out. A landmark moment.
Absolutely. And Darwin was clever in how he structured it. He actually included a chapter on difficulties for the theory.
Tackling the problems head on. Like what?
Things like, well, why don't we see more transitional fossils? How could something incredibly complex like an eye or a whale's baleen filter evolve step by step? He offered explanations based on gradual modification and the imperfection of the fossil record.
Showing he'd thought through the objections. What about humans? Did he dive straight into human evolution and origin?
He was very cautious there. Just that one famous sentence, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. He only merely alluded, as he put it later, to sexual selection playing a role in human races in that book. He tackled human evolution directly, much later in The Descent of Man.
There's also that bit about adding by the creator to the closing sentence in the second edition. What's the story there?
It's debated. The final sentence originally ended, breathed into a few forms or into one. He added, by the creator, later. Some see it as him trying to appease religious critics. Others think it reflected his view that God might have initiated life through natural laws. We don't know for sure his exact thinking there.
And the reaction was pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. Immediate hostility from many quarters, famous caricatures of him as an ape. But because Darwin was already a respected scientist, his book had to be taken seriously, even by critics.
The famous Oxford debate comes to mind. Bishop Wilberforce versus Huxley.
The legendary showdown. Apparently, Wilberforce hadn't even read the book properly and tried to ridicule Huxley, famously asking if he was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side.
And Huxley's reply.
Reportedly something like he'd rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his intellect to obscure the truth. It became a symbol of the science versus religion clash, though the reality was more complex.
But despite the uproar, the core idea of evolution, of descent with modification, actually caught on relatively quickly among scientists.
Surprisingly fast, yes. By the mid-1870s, evolutionism, the general idea that life evolves, was largely accepted in scientific circles. Natural selection itself, the mechanism Darwin proposed, took longer to gain full acceptance.
So, moving beyond his own time, how did his ideas continue to shape things? What about the religious response over the longer term?
It was really varied. You had theologians like Charles Hodge arguing that Darwinism, specifically meaning evolution without divine design, was tantamount to atheism.
But not everyone saw it that way.
No, figures like the clergyman Charles Kingsley actually found natural selection compatible with faith, calling it just as noble a conception of deity. After about 1875, many Protestant thinkers found ways to reconcile evolution with their faith, perhaps seeing Genesis figuratively, though some rejected it outright based on Scripture. Few, however, insisted on a literal young earth at that time.
And the Catholic Church, their stance has shifted significantly over time.
It really has. In 1950, Pope Pius XII said evolution could be compatible with faith regarding the origin of the human body, though not the soul. Then Pope John Paul II in 1996 called evolution more than our hypothesis.
And Pope Benedict XVI in 2007 basically said the supposed clash between evolution and creationism is an absurdity, a huge shift.
Definitely. Now, we need to touch on a much darker side of how Darwin's ideas were interpreted or twisted after his time. Social Darwinism and eugenics.
Right, and it's absolutely crucial we stress, as our sources do, that these were later developments that often misapplied or distorted Darwin's scientific ideas. We're just reporting on this historical development impartially.
Exactly. The eugenics movement really took off in the 1880s onwards, using distorted concepts from Darwinism to claim scientific justification for their aims.
They made distinctions like positive eugenics, encouraging people with supposedly good traits to reproduce, versus negative eugenics.
Yes, and negative eugenics led to horrific policies aimed at preventing or removing supposedly unfit individuals, often targeting the poor, minorities, and the disabled.
including those awful compulsory sterilization laws in the U.S. Over 64,000 people were sterilized against their will. Immigrants, people of color, unmarried mothers, the mentally ill.
And similar laws existed in Canada and Australia. It's a chilling part of history. And, disturbingly, Adolf Hitler explicitly cited California's sterilization programs as an inspiration. He warped survival of the fittest into a justification for Nazi eugenics and the mass murder of groups deemed biologically inferior.
A truly horrifying misapplication of scientific concepts. Okay, bringing it back to the science itself. After Darwin, evolutionary theory continued to develop, right?
Right.
There was a period called the eclipse of Darwinism.
Yeah, for a while in the early 20th century, natural selection fell a bit out of favor as scientists explored other mechanisms like Lamarckism or mutation-driven evolution.
Hmm.
But then came the modern evolutionary synthesis.
What was that?
That's when scientists like R.A. Fisher integrated Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian genetics, the understanding of how traits are actually inherited through genes. This provided the missing piece Darwin didn't have, showing how variation arises and is passed on, solidifying selection as the core mechanism.
And the science keeps evolving. We now have fields like Evo-Devo.
Evolutionary developmental biology, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. They study how the development of organisms has evolved. A key finding is homologous genes.
Meaning?
Genes that are fundamentally the same across vastly different species because they were inherited from a common ancestor. Like the PAX6 gene, which is crucial for eye development and everything from mice to fruit flies.
Wow. So the basic genetic toolkit for building things like eyes or body plans gets reused again and again.
Exactly. It suggests nature often makes these important discoveries just once, the genetic level, and then modifies them. We see genes controlling the head-to-tail axis that are shared across almost all animals.
Or what about epigenetics? That's a newer field-generating buzz.
It is. Epigenetics looks at changes in gene expression, how genes are turned on or off, that don't involve changes to the DNA sequence itself, but can still be influenced by the environment and, crucially, can sometimes be inherited.
So it's not just about the genes you have, but how they're used, and that can be passed down.
In some cases, yes. It shows that heredity is a process, not a preformation. It's more dynamic than just a fixed blueprint. And what's really interesting is Darwin himself actually believed heredity was some kind of process, not fixed particles. He didn't have the mechanism, but his intuition was, again, kind of ahead of its time.
So wrapping this all up, Darwin's impact is just immense. As Wallace said, he revolutionized the whole study of nature. A leading paleoanthropologist today calls him the preeminent evolutionary scientist of all time.
It's hard to argue with that. What strikes me is how the science continues to build on his foundation. Evo-Devo, epigenetics, they aren't overturning Darwin, they're adding layers of detail and complexity he couldn't have imagined, but which ultimately validates his core insights. Even his Beagle Diary became a bestseller, seen as having far more general interest than his captain's official narrative.
Thinking about his journey, the initial doubts, the health struggles, the sheer persistence needed to develop and defend such a revolutionary idea, it's quite inspiring, isn't it? He kept questioning, kept observing.
That grandeur in this view of life, as he wrote in the famous Closing of Origin, really captures it. Life constantly evolving, branching, adapting.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is how can we apply a bit of that Darwinian curiosity? His journey shows that knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied. How might this deep dive spark your own explorations, your own questioning of the world around you?
Yeah, what assumptions could you challenge? What unexplored territory and knowledge, or even in your own thinking, could you venture into with that same spirit of relentless inquiry? The world's still full of wonders to figure out.